As the evening settles gently and the world around you fades into a distant murmur, you may imagine yourself entering a quiet space where time seems to slow, as if offering you a chance to breathe more deeply. This is where the story begins, a long unfolding tale drifting like a soft current of air that moves without haste, guiding you into a calm space of knowledge and curiosity. You may sense your breathing gradually aligning with the rhythm of this narrative, a rhythm that does not require you to grasp everything at once, but invites you to let each image form one by one. Imagine yourself seated comfortably as the distance between you and the outer world widens, creating a safe space where you can observe without urgency or expectation. The story you are about to hear is not one that demands, but instead moves with steady gentleness. Together, we will enter a realm shaped by history and mystery, yet held within a peaceful atmosphere that allows you to follow without pressure. You will find that this tale is not solely about a place or an event, but also about the experience of descending into a rarely discussed space, one that holds human traces and decisions from the past, meant for a future that has not yet arrived. Before we go further, I invite you to release any tension in your shoulders. Feel the weight of your body supported by where you sit and allow your mind to receive each image without judgment. You may imagine this journey as entering a long corridor with cool air and soft light cast across its walls, a corridor that does not threaten, but instead encourages you to notice the small details usually overlooked. In this story, we will move toward an underground chamber built deep beneath the desert of New Mexico, a place designed to remain closed for 10,000 years, a place that shelters something meant never to be disturbed by the future. But before we reach that world, we will begin slowly ensuring that each step feels steady, each explanation arrives gently, and each description helps you feel present within the narrative. There is no need to hurry, for this tale is shaped to accompany a long and quiet journey, like the whisper of the night wind, moving without purpose, except to bring you nearer to the mystery waiting ahead. In a year far removed from your memory, in a quiet stretch of New Mexico that felt like a fragment of another world, scientists and engineers began to realize that humanity needed a space not only strong, but capable of withstanding the slow, unending passage of time. You stand imagining that landscape when everything was still blueprints and long debates. When the desert reflected a golden afternoon glow, revealing how vast and fragile the world they wished to protect truly was. The air felt dry and slightly dusty, and the desert wind carried a faint signal of changes that would last thousands of years. The planner spoke in calm, steady tones about something that must never be touched by future generations. Something to be stored, hidden, and secured from anyone who would live long after their era ended. The nearest small town witnessed the arrival of heavy machinery and teams of specialists from many disciplines, from geology to anthropology, each bringing knowledge that would shape the meaning of the room that must never be opened. Beneath the activity, you could sense that every decision was guided by an awareness that this project was not for the present age, but for a distant future that might not even recognize the world as you know it. When night came and the New Mexico sky became a vast canvas of stars, researchers often gazed at the dark horizon, contemplating the risks and the enormous responsibility they were preparing to leave behind for future civilizations. They knew that whatever they placed underground would remain long after languages changed. Culture shifted, and history rewrote itself again and again. You feel the silence of the desert as if witnessing that wait, a silence that affirms time will continue, no matter how hard humanity tries to stop it. Building this facility was not only a technical matter, but also a moral one, a promise that your generation must leave a warning for the sake of caution. Yet the question lingered whether the future would listen. In that imagined scene, you see how everything began with good intentions, and a deep understanding that the world sometimes needs protection even from its own traces. And it was here that the earliest foundations of WIPP slowly took shape, supported by hopes and signs that would run side by side for generations to come. The chosen location was not a decision formed overnight, because the land in southern Mexico carried stories older than the civilization that was building upon it. You imagine yourself walking across the desert surface that looks calm, while deep beneath your feet lies a vast layer of ancient salt formed hundreds of millions of years ago, when this region was still the floor of a long-vanished sea. Geologists understood that salt slowly seals, fractures, and compresses empty spaces, a natural quality that made it ideal as a repository for something that should never again be touched by human hands. You can sense how scientists studied every corner of geological maps, ensuring that no tectonic activity would disturb the depth of that place for thousands of years. They faced the reality that choosing a location meant determining the fate of information for generations that did not yet exist. Meanwhile, anthropologists considered how a warning should be conveyed to the distant future, a task that sounded simple, but became an almost philosophical dilemma. They asked what language would be understood 10 millennia from now, and whether symbols considered universal today would truly endure the shifting comprehension of humanity. Around the still empty area, you see lines of heavy vehicles rolling in, leaving long trails on the soft sand which the wind soon erased. As if the desert wished to remind everyone that human presence is temporary. The sunlight striking the ground revealed how every small detail mattered, from the type of rock to the direction of groundwater flow, all examined to ensure that whatever was stored down there would pose no threat to anyone in the future. As night slowly fell and the desert temperature dropped quickly, the researchers gathered in temporary shelters to discuss reports that resembled the archives of a lifetime. They spoke with measured tones, yet you could sense the moral weight that could not be ignored. They were creating a place meant to endure far longer than any monument humanity had ever constructed. Amid all these considerations, you realize the location was chosen not only for its geological strength, but also for the silence of the desert, which offered a sense of timeless firmness, as if nature itself extended protection to something that must never be touched again. In that quiet, the seed of a forbidden room began to take shape. The years leading up to the beginning of construction brought an atmosphere that felt like a long period of waiting, as though the entire project was holding its breath before entering a truly decisive stage. You imagine a very early morning in the New Mexico desert when the first workers arrived while the light was still pale, and the cold air bit the skin, creating a sharp contrast with the heat that would soon emerge later in the day. In the distance, low ridges framed the horizon, yet within that silence a major decision had already been made that humanity would dig into the earth not to seek treasure or resources, but to hide something it created yet wished to forget. Everyone involved knew that what would be sealed in the depths would remain dangerous long after today's technologies and languages might exist only as fragments of history. You see engineers standing over marked points in the soil, nodding slowly while recalculating the estimated strength of structures meant to withstand the weight of time for dozens of centuries. As trucks carrying heavy materials arrived, desert dust rose and drifted in slow spirals, creating a thin veil that made sunlight shimmer gently, expanding and contracting depending on the wind. Environmental scientists examined soil samples carefully, explaining that the natural processes of salt formations would gradually seal the excavated chambers, making the place not only a storage site, but a natural vault slowly swallowing everything within. You sense the seriousness surrounding the project camp. Every report read thoroughly, and every suggestion weighed, as if even the smallest decision might influence the safety of humanity thousands of years from now. At night, when a small fire was lit to warm the cold desert air, some workers sat watching the stars shining brightly above in a sky untouched by light pollution. You hear someone say softly that this project is essentially not just construction, but a long from the present to the future, a message telling them not to open what lies below, because whatever is buried is no longer owned by anyone. In that quiet night, you feel that the first step had been taken toward creating a chamber not only physically hidden, but also deeply symbolic. A room that must remain sealed through a span of time difficult for modern minds to comprehend. In the early years, when the concept of the isolation room was first discussed formally, the atmosphere in scientific meeting halls felt like a mixture of worry and a quiet restraint. You can imagine researchers from various fields sitting around a long table surrounded by thick documents filled with long-term hazard calculations and geological simulations extending thousands of years into the future. They spoke slowly, as though each word needed to pass through a layer of heavy moral consideration. Outside the meeting hall, the desert seemed indifferent to the immense consequences of the decisions being shaped. But inside, everyone knew that whatever they approved would affect generations who might no longer even know who they were. You see a geologist presenting a map of the underground structures, explaining that the salt formations, which have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, could slowly collapse back into the excavated chambers and naturally seal whatever is buried there. Some nodded in cautious agreement, yet remained uncertain, knowing that predictions about such distant futures can only be estimated through models filled with assumptions. A linguist then spoke about another challenge, which was how to warn future humans who may no longer understand any language that exists today. Imagine that person lifting a board marked with symbols designed to appear threatening, yet informative, then explaining that there is no guarantee that future generations will understand these symbols as warnings rather than invitations to explore. You listen as they consider types of permanent warnings that must outlast any monument humans have ever created. They discuss the possibility of using art, abstract forms, or patterns that cannot be easily misread. Still, doubts arise whether any message can truly survive 10 millennia without losing its meaning. In a corner, a historian added that humanity has a natural tendency to approach the hidden. He reminded them that history is filled with places once sealed, yet eventually reopened by later generations. The silence that followed his statement revealed that everyone in the room understood the weight of their task. This chamber must remain sealed, not just for their lifespans, but through the entire arc of civilizations yet to be born. The quiet felt like an invisible wall separating the present from the unknowable future. When the meeting ended, the participants stepped slowly into the warm desert sunlight. You can feel the weight of the undecided choices hanging in the air like thin dust shifting in the wind. They knew the construction of the isolation vault was not simply engineering, but a long pact between humanity and time, an effort to shield the world from the poison created by their own civilization. And beneath every scientific discussion, you sense they were grappling with a much larger question about how humanity lives and leaves its imprint on a world that always moves forward without pause. In the next stage, as the plan for the isolation chamber moved into more detailed technical discussions, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter and more calculated. You may imagine a large room filled with geological diagrams and clay models illustrating how the salt formations beneath New Mexico would creep and press back into the excavated cavities. Engineers sat beside geologists, trying to understand how the incredibly slow yet relentless pressure of the earth could serve as their ally in sealing away materials that must not be touched for 10,000 years. Every line they drew and every simulation they ran had to account for a future they could not see. They knew the Earth never rests, so their design had to accept slow changes occurring on timescales far too long for human intuition. You see them marking maps with small circles indicating where chambers would be carved and where natural walls would be left to contract again like a wound closing over centuries. At another table, a radiation physicist calculated how the hazardous materials would decay over time. He wrote long sequences of numbers and explained that some isotopes would remain active far beyond the lifespan of modern civilization. You can feel the air grow heavier as he mentioned that certain substances would still be dangerous long after human languages may have transformed into something unrecognizable. Meanwhile, mining specialists described how the tunnels needed to be dug deep, enough to avoid groundwater movement, erosion, and any future human activity. They spoke slowly, aware that a small error in calculation could become a massive threat for people who might live thousands of years after them. Meanwhile, an anthropologist observed the discussion from a different perspective. She did not focus on rock layers or earth pressure, but on human behavior. She explained that humans are naturally curious about what lies underground. You may imagine her drawing a long line on paper, marking it as a 10,000-year timeline, and pointing out that no cultural legacy has ever survived unchanged for such a span. She questioned how they could ensure that someone in the future would not mistake the chamber for a sacred site or a vault of valuable relics. Her question returned the room to silence, and everyone realized that the greatest challenge was not merely sealing the chamber, but ensuring that no one would ever have reason to open it. As the discussion ended, the day had turned to dusk. Sunlight stretched across the floor, and you can sense that these specialists were trying to build something greater than an underground structure. They were trying to build a bridge between the present and a distant future, filled only with hope that humanity would respect the warnings left by their predecessors. And beneath their quiet footsteps, leaving the room, you feel that the project was not simply about containing poison, but about acknowledging how fragile time becomes when confronted with human will. Several weeks after the series of technical discussions concluded, the experts gathered again, but this time the atmosphere felt heavier, as if they had begun to realize that the idea they were shaping was not merely about engineering or scientific predictions, but about confronting the limits of human knowledge itself. In this follow-up meeting, a large model of the underground repository was placed at the center of the table, now equipped with warning markers designed not only to be read, but to be felt by anyone who saw them. You may imagine the symbols rough and asymmetrical, resembling deliberate scratches, meant to provoke a sense of danger at the most primitive level. The designers argued that human language may vanish, but fear usually lasts longer than words. Meanwhile, linguists brought long scrolls filled with sketches of hypothetical language structures that might emerge thousands of years from now. They did not try to guess future vocabulary, but studied the general patterns of how languages evolve, how meanings shift, and how symbols are easily misinterpreted. Their voices drifted softly through the room. They explained that any warning created today would eventually battle against the erosion of context and original intention. They asked whether it was possible to create a message that could never be misunderstood. No one answered, because everyone knew that humans always find a way to interpret things according to their imagination. At another corner, a visual artist newly assigned to the team presented a concept for an artificial landscape designed to unsettle anyone approaching the repository. He showed sketches of rows of leaning monoliths with serrated surfaces and sharp shadows stretching like teeth. He explained that a place never meant to be opened must look like a wound that should not be touched. You can feel the tension as he noted that the design was not intended to attract attention, but to repel human curiosity. Yet a historian objected, reminding the group that many ancient civilizations were drawn to strange structures, considering them sacred or filled with mystery. Art meant as a warning could become an invitation to generations yet unborn. That exchange of ideas made the room feel denser, and the experts realized how dangerous differences in perception across generations could be. They were trying to construct a message that might outlast all human cultures, something no one in history had ever succeeded in creating. When the meeting ended, there was no definitive conclusion, but everyone sensed that they had entered a realm of thought rarely touched by human minds. They understood that this project was not only about burying danger, but about creating a legacy that asks one simple thing of the future: not to touch anything they have left behind. In the next meeting, the atmosphere shifted even further from technical discussion into something more philosophical. As if the experts slowly recognized that the repository project had drawn them into a realm usually reserved for cultural theory or metaphysics. At the center of the room, a large screen displayed long-term simulations. In those animations, the warning structures gradually changed under the influence of wind erosion or shifting ground. You may imagine time accelerated by thousands of years in mere seconds, showing symbols that were once distinct, fading into shapes that blended into barely recognizable patterns. The geologists explained that no material is truly eternal. Thus, the idea of creating a physical warning that survives 10 millennia is a paradox they must confront. The psychologists then took over. They explained that human fear does not always behave predictably. Some people are drawn toward danger, especially when that danger is not immediately obvious. You can imagine a psychologist drawing two simple diagrams. One shows fear as something that repels humans from an object, while the other illustrates fear that instead sparks curiosity. They emphasized that the challenge was not to terrify future generations, but to ensure that fear would not transform into temptation. Everyone listened tensely because they understood there was no method to guarantee how future minds would function thousands of years from now. A paleoclimatologist added yet another layer of complexity. It presented graphs predicting long-term climate shifts. Over 10,000 years, the region could change dramatically perhaps, becoming wetter, drier, frozen, or even a barren desert. Anything they built today must survive conditions that current generations could barely imagine. He explained that if the site were ever buried under ice or sand, the warning structures that seem ominous today might be reduced to abstract shapes carrying no message at all. The room fell quiet again as they realized time was not merely a passage, but an active force reshaping form, meaning, and intent. Near the end of the session, a disaster historian provided a striking perspective. He described how throughout history, humans repeatedly encountered remnants of older civilizations, and their first reaction was almost always admiration rather than caution. He reminded them that ruins tend to be interpreted as heritage, something worthy of study or reverence. You can sense how his words stole the breath from many in the room because the implication was unavoidable. Whatever they left behind could easily be misunderstood as something valuable to explore. As the session adjourned, they remained seated for a moment as if no one wished to be the first to rise. They realized that the further they progressed, the clearer it became that this project was not merely about constructing an underground system or designing warning markers, but about attempting to reach through the fog of a future too vast to comprehend. And in that lingering silence, they felt a growing awareness that what they were truly fighting for was not only safety, but a form of communication across time that might never be entirely flawless. At the next stage, the planners shifted their focus toward understanding how the human body would react when entering a subterranean space that was never meant to be visited, but only to be forgotten. You can imagine environmental health specialists gathering around a long table, examining charts, showing air concentration, internal pressure, and potential microclimate shifts if someone in the distant future were to enter the isolation chamber by accident. They acknowledged that although the chamber was designed never to be opened, there remained a small possibility that a future civilization driven by curiosity or ignorance would attempt to breach it, as has often occurred throughout human history. This forced them to calculate how decayed materials could affect human lungs, skin, and even perception. You may picture their thoughts extending far beyond their own era, imagining someone living centuries or millennia later who might unknowingly walk toward something that should never be disturbed. Meanwhile, ergonomics experts and safety engineers considered how the space would appear to human eyes in the future. They predicted that the curvature of the narrowing walls, the tightening floor, and the low ceiling could create strange illusions, making the room seem to shift or tremble despite being structurally stable. They also anticipated that the salt formations slowly closing the chamber would create uneven surfaces, forming patterns that might resemble hand marks or scratches, though they would simply be the quiet work of the earth. You may imagine a future visitor stepping inside and feeling as though the chamber were alive, even though all movement belonged only to geological pressure. As the discussions progressed, they agreed that the most dangerous element was not only the toxic material inside, but the risk that someone might misinterpret the warnings they left behind. Therefore, they concluded that every detail of the chamber must be crafted to convey danger without stirring curiosity. The space needed to feel foreign, silent, and unwelcoming, so that anyone who saw it would instinctively step away. In that way, they hoped the chamber would endure not only through structural resilience, but also through human intuition, recognizing that safer places exist than a sealed depth meant to remain untouched for millennia. The following day, the researchers reconvened to discuss something that seemed simple yet required far deeper thought: how light should be treated. In a space meant to remain untouched by sunlight for thousands of years. You may imagine a large table covered with sketches illustrating how total darkness would evolve over time and how the eyes of modern humans, as well as the eyes of humans who might exist in the far future, would respond to that darkness. Optical specialists explained that a space without light tends to erase orientation, and that anyone entering might feel as though their body were dissolving. They noted that in complete darkness, the sound of one's own breathing could echo faintly, as if drifting between slowly shifting salt layers. You may sense the profound stillness of such a room and the psychological depth it could impose. After being left untouched for millennia, environmental psychologists then described how unnatural darkness often creates a sense of presence, even when nothing exists within it. They explained that humans tend to feel watched in sealed spaces, lacking signs of life, and that the mind often fills such emptiness with images drawn from its most primitive fears. They warned that someone in the future, entering the chamber without historical understanding, might interpret it as the remnant of an ancient ritual or a threshold to something deeper. This possibility of misinterpretation was what the designers sought to avoid. Since the chamber was neither a monument nor a message, but a warning. Meanwhile, geologists explained that the salinity and faint moisture deep within the salt formation could create tiny reflections on the walls, appearing like light sources, it being nothing more than mineral glimmers under pressure. They noted that anyone seeing those glints without context might believe there was energy within the chamber or something trying to emerge. You may imagine how such a simple crystalline reflection could become a dangerous misunderstanding when combined with the persistent human instinct to explore the unknown. Thus, they concluded that the chamber must be shaped without patterns or forms that could attract imagination. The walls should remain rough, so they could not be interpreted as symbols. No structure should resemble an altar, a hidden door, or a sacred axis. The chamber must promise nothing, offering only deep quiet and a gentle discomfort enough to make anyone who finds it turn away. In that way, the absence of light would stand as a silent guardian for a secret that must not be awakened. After discussing the eternal darkness of the chamber, the designers moved to another question equally important: how the scent of the room would evolve across thousands of years, and how the human sense of smell in the distant future might shape their interpretation of the space. You may imagine chemists seated around a table presenting diagrams of how certain gases might slowly form through interactions between salt and internal pressure. They explained that even though the chamber was meant to remain sealed forever, there was still a chance that faint mineral odors would merge, evoking the scent of an ancient storage vault or a long-abandoned cavern. They estimated that the odor might not be harmful, yet strong enough to create instinctive caution, as though the room were exhaling a very old, slow breath from deep within the earth. Psychologists noted that the sense of smell is one of the strongest triggers of emotional memory. If someone in the distant future entered the chamber and encountered an unfamiliar scent, they might associate it with danger even without any explicit threat. They reminded the team that humans often rely on smell to judge whether a place is safe. A scent too unusual could convince someone that the chamber once held something dark or hidden, while a scent too neutral could create the quiet illusion that the space was safe to explore. The designers wanted to avoid both misunderstandings. Meanwhile, geologists explained that the shifting layers of salt would continue to compress and reshape the chamber, creating unpredictable microcurrents of air. Even the slightest pressure change could carry a trace of the chamber's inner odor toward whatever entrance might remain. You may imagine a silent corridor exhaling a faint, unidentifiable scent, making anyone who stands at its threshold feel that the space within is slowly moving even though nothing is alive inside it. Thus, the experts agreed that the chamber must be designed so that it produces no scent capable of triggering curiosity or implying a hidden past. They decided that no organic materials or supports prone to decay should be used. Everything within the chamber had to be purely mineral and enduring to prevent any change in aroma over millennia. In this way, they hoped the space would not tempt anyone to step further, because it offered no invitation, no sensory pull, and no sign that it had ever wanted to be discovered. The chamber must remain neutral, silent, and devoid of features that could feed imagination. In its emptiness, they hoped it would endure untouched. After ensuring that no scent would mislead future visitors, the designers faced another challenge, more abstract, yet equally significant: how the silence within the chamber would be perceived by anyone who entered it unintentionally. Silence to some is a sign of peace, but to others it can symbolize an unseen threat. Acoustic experts explained that a deep underground chamber made of salt and other mineral layers can absorb sound so thoroughly that it creates not merely quietness, but a silence that feels heavy. They called it absolute silence, a condition in which only one's heartbeat and the pulse of one's own blood can be heard, a condition known to trigger primitive anxiety in many people. Psychologists emphasized again that humans instinctively rely on patterns of sound to judge whether a place is safe. Even a faint echo can provide clues about the size or direction of a space. But if someone enters a chamber that reflects no sound at all, it may feel as though the walls have no distance or boundaries. The space may feel like a void expanding outward. They warned that this could create a sensation of entrapment, even when the room is not physically confining. For an unprepared visitor, the experience might resemble stepping into the unfinished belly of a mountain. Engineers then considered whether the surfaces should be designed to reflect a minimal amount of sound, so the silence would not feel threatening. But this idea was rejected quickly because adding materials like metal or textured structures could trigger curiosity. Someone in the future might interpret such details as intentional features meant to convey a message. Worse, they might assume the chamber once held machinery or something valuable, prompting further exploration. The discussion led to a simple but decisive conclusion: the chamber must remain quiet, yet not in a way that evokes a menacing emptiness. To achieve this, the experts agreed to maintain a simple geometric shape without large curves that might create long echoes, and without narrow corners that could amplify footsteps. The chamber would be shaped so sound would fade naturally, but not completely. Anyone entering would still hear the faint trace of their own movements, as if the space acknowledged their presence but did not seek to engage with them. The room was meant to make silence a background, not a message. Nothing within it should call out or warn. No echo should prompt someone to seek its origin. No mineral whisper should stir the imagination. The chamber had to be a passive container, a place that does not wish to be remembered or interpreted. By keeping silence at just the right threshold, they believed the room would appear unimportant, ensuring that its presence would not provoke questions. After resolving the issues surrounding scent and silence, the designers entered a far more complex stage, considering how any light that might accidentally penetrate the chamber could shape the perception of future humans. They understood that although the room was intended to remain sealed forever, geological shifts or small inevitable fractures over thousands of years might create narrow openings through which light could seep. Even the faintest light could become symbolic information to anyone encountering it, and for that reason, the experts felt obligated to understand how light might influence meaning. Physicists explained that light entering through tiny openings tends to form thin lines that move with the rotation of the Earth and the shifting of seasons. For someone entering the chamber without knowing its purpose, such a beam might appear intentionally placed. They might believe it to be a directional marker or a sign of ritual significance. A slowly moving shadow along the wall could give the impression that the chamber was once used to track the passage of time. This would endanger the chamber's primary purpose, which is to avoid attracting curiosity. Historians warned that throughout human history, light has often symbolized knowledge, guidance, or revelation. If someone in the distant future saw a faint light leaking through the wall, they might interpret it as an invitation to approach, or as a clue leading toward something hidden. Even a brief glimmer on a mineral surface could spark imaginations that tie the chamber to ancient and mysterious narratives. To prevent such misunderstandings, the designers decided to sculpt the interior surfaces with textures that scatter light randomly. They wanted to ensure that if light were ever to enter, it would not form patterns or lines that could be interpreted as messages. The light should break into small, unpredictable reflections that point nowhere and carry no meaning. In this way, the light would lose its symbolic power and become nothing more than a natural phenomenon devoid of significance. Additionally, the engineers agreed that the room's geometry must avoid sharp angles, where light could concentrate into focused reflections. They chose shapes that caused light to diffuse widely, so anyone entering would see only a soft, ambient glow, offering no direction. No signal to follow, no lines resembling a guide, and no shift in brightness that might be mistaken for a sign of life. In the end, their purpose remained the same: to create a chamber that offers no meaning. Whatever light enters must open no stories. Light must not invite anyone deeper. The chamber must remain a place left alone, uninteresting, and unprovocative. By eliminating the symbolism of light, they hoped the chamber would remain quiet, meaningless, and forgotten just as intended. After settling the question of light, the designers entered a subtler, yet equally important domain: how the chamber would shape a person's perception of time if someone in the distant future happened to discover it. They understood that an underground space without sound or visible change could distort human temporal orientation. You may imagine them gathered in a workspace, reviewing studies on how humans perceive time in environments devoid of sensory input. In such a space, seconds may feel like minutes, and minutes like hours. For an unprepared individual, the experience could trigger fear or, instead, awaken curiosity that might drive them deeper into the chamber. Cognitive psychologists explain that the human brain needs stable rhythms to maintain a consistent sense of time. Without sound, without motion, without fluctuations of light, a person may feel as though the world around them has stopped. Some might interpret this sensory pause as evidence that the chamber once served spiritual or meditative purposes. This posed a danger because it could encourage mystical interpretations. The designers wanted to eliminate any possibility of such meanings arising. Anthropologists added that throughout human history, spaces without the passage of time were often associated with thresholds between the physical and symbolic worlds, between the present and the past. Someone in the future sensed temporal distortion inside the chamber. They might believe it preserved memories of an ancient civilization or possessed special power. Again, this would run counter to the chamber's purpose of discouraging interaction. To counter this, the engineers and psychologists collaborated to design an interior that would not create extreme temporal sensations. They decided that the interior surfaces should include slight irregularities, not to form patterns, but to produce extremely faint sound reflections when someone moves inside. These reflections should not be strong enough to provide direction, but sufficient to remind the visitor that the physical world remains present. With these nearly inaudible echoes, human perception of time would not collapse. They also agreed that the chamber's shape must prevent acoustic resonance. If resonance occurred, even a small step could transform into a prolonged echo, giving the illusion that time stretches or slows. Structural geometry experts designed arches and angled walls that break sound waves before they form repeating patterns. In the end, the designers realized they were not building an empty void, but a space that must feel entirely ordinary to anyone who enters. The chamber must not accelerate time, slow it, or suspend it. By removing extreme temporal experiences, they hoped the chamber would produce no legends, no myths, and no stories. It must remain a place without time, not in a transcendent sense, but in the sense of offering no sensation at all. In that absence lies the final safeguard, ensuring that no human of the future feels compelled to explore deeper. After ensuring that temporal perception would not be distorted, the designers turned to an often overlooked yet influential aspect: how the echo of footsteps would sound when someone walked through the corridor leading to the isolation chamber. They understood that the sound of footsteps is not merely an acoustic trace, but an instinctive signal that helps humans judge the size of a space, whether it is wide, narrow, empty, or filled with something unseen. You may imagine acoustic specialists studying graphs that mapped the behavior of sound waves against salt surfaces that were neither fully hard nor fully soft. They explained that salt absorbs part of a sound wave while reflecting another portion, creating an echo quality that is delicate, almost like a sound that ages in the air before fading completely. Psychologists warned that if footsteps sounded too crisp, the space might feel like an empty hall waiting for something. If footsteps were too muted, someone might feel as though they had stepped out of the physical world into an abstract space not belonging to nature. Both possibilities had to be avoided. A space that sounds too alive invites exploration, while a space too dead stimulates deeper curiosity. The chamber needed to rest precisely between the two in a delicate balance. Geometric acousticians suggested designing a slightly textured floor so that footsteps would scatter into many tiny frequencies, preventing long echoes. Yet the texture had to be subtle enough so as not to resemble a pattern or deliberate structure. They wanted to ensure no future visitor would interpret the acoustic traces as part of a ritual or ancient cultural symbol. You may imagine a floor that appears simple, yet is engineered with precision, bridging physics and human instinct. They also determined that the length of the corridor mattered greatly. A corridor too long could transform simple echoes into the illusion of a second pair of footsteps following from behind. Such sensations might inspire stories or legends that could persist for generations. Therefore, the corridor needed to be built to an ideal length so that each step produced no accidental narrative within the profound quiet. In the end, the designers understood that human footsteps are a small language that never stops speaking, even in the quietest spaces. They wanted this language to say nothing, not to suggest that someone was being followed, not to welcome anyone, and not to imply that the chamber possessed a life of its own. In the near silent softening of each echo, they hoped the isolation chamber would convey no message at all to whoever might walk there thousands of years from now. Once the issue of footstep echoes was considered stable, the designers turned to another subtle element: how the very last traces of light entering the corridor would behave before vanishing into the complete darkness of the isolation chamber. They understood that even though the corridor was designed to receive almost no illumination, there was still a possibility that faint glimmers from the outside world might be carried in weather from a metallic reflection on someone's equipment or a brief glint from exposed skin. Such light, even in its smallest amount, could alter perception. Light that disappears too abruptly may create the impression that the space devours all signs of life, while light that fades slowly may suggest that the corridor has its own breathing rhythm, rising and falling in gentle intervals. Thus, optical specialists proposed using walls with near-perfect diffusion properties, so that any stray reflection would not form a point or a direction. The light had to spread so evenly that it would be impossible to tell whether it arrived from ahead or behind, from the ceiling or from the floor. You may imagine researchers testing surfaces that appeared rough, up close, yet became remarkably efficient diffusers when observed from the corridor's end. They wanted every leftover glimmer of light to lose its identity, transforming into a visual haze with no narrative. Psychologists warned again that faint light often becomes the seed of human imagination. A shifting may be interpreted as a person approaching a vague blur might be seen as a sign or signal. Therefore, the corridor must not allow light to transform into anything legible as a message. Light needed to remain neutral, offering no hope, no fear, and no opening for excessive interpretation. Darkroom designers also reminded the group that human eyes require a certain period to adjust to absolute darkness. If that adjustment happened too quickly, someone might feel that the space was too welcoming, as though it had prepared itself for human presence. If the adjustment took too long, someone might feel trapped in the space without boundaries. Hence, the faint distribution of light at the corridor's entrance had to produce the correct transition between brightness and darkness, neither too sudden nor too gentle. In the end, the designers understood that light carries an inherent ability to construct stories, even when it is nearly absent. The space had to be built so that light would not become a narrator, not a witness, and not an instrument for imagining what should not be imagined. They wanted to ensure that whoever entered the corridor would not interpret anything from the last traces of light accompanying them. In the quiet fading of illumination, they hoped the isolation chamber would remain a place without story, without guidance, and without message. After the final traces of light had been discussed, the designers shifted their focus to something more abstract, yet even more influential: how the space would influence a person's perception of direction. They understood that humans instinctively seek orientation even in unfamiliar places. The head naturally tries to guess which side is more open, which direction feels closer to the outside world, or whether a faint current of air indicates a door or hidden passage. Underground environmental specialists warn that if the corridor had even the smallest irregularity in its wall texture or air distribution, someone might conclude a direction as though solving a puzzle that was never intended to exist. Geomagnetic experts were brought in to ensure that no subtle magnetic fluctuations could be detected either by simple instruments or by the intuition of someone unusually sensitive to spatial changes. They reminded the team that Earth's magnetic field can interact with certain salt formations, producing tiny gradients invisible to the eye, but still detectable by sensors or even by a faint impression felt by a person walking too deeply into silence. If such gradients existed, the space would no longer be neutral, it would possess a readable direction. To prevent this, they modified the corridor's shape so that it would not present an overly long straight line. Straight lines can make someone feel as though there is a destination point ahead. Instead, gentle curves were chosen to ensure that orientation could not be easily determined. Yet these curves could not be too pronounced, as they might appear intentional. They needed to resemble natural geological shifts rather than design choices. In that way, no visitor could confidently say where the corridor led or from where it originated. Ventilation specialists added that even the slightest airflow could become a directional clue. Thus, the airflow system had to be built to operate with the faintest pressure, barely moving any air knot. Disturbing dust particles and not creating variations in temperature. Temperature differences along the corridor might convince someone that they were approaching or moving away from something. Therefore, the corridor needed a perfectly consistent temperature so that no point felt warmer or colder. In the end, the designers understood that orientation is an ancient instinct, always searching for meaning, even in spaces that hold none. If that instinct were allowed to operate freely, a person could create a story from the direction of their own steps. Thus, the corridor leading to the isolation chamber had to be designed so that direction itself would fade as a concept. Anyone walking within it would not feel they were moving toward or away from anything. They would only sense that they were continuing through a space without purpose, without hint, and without destination. In this way, the isolation chamber could remain a place that gives no direction, offers no interpretation, and provides nothing except its own existence. Once the matter of orientation was settled, the designers turned their attention to how the rhythm of a person's footsteps would change as they moved deeper toward the isolation chamber. They understood that humans never walk with a fully mechanical rhythm. Even the smallest shifts in emotion, hesitation, comfort, fatigue, or alertness alter the length of a step and the weight applied to the floor. Human behavior specialists explain that the rhythm of walking is a mirror of internal states. A corridor that feels too rigid might push someone to walk faster, while one that feels too soft might slow them down as though they were waiting for something they cannot name. Therefore, the rhythm formed indirectly by the corridor must remain neutral and subtle. Surface material experts advise that the floor texture should not only break sound frequencies, but also maintain the balance of each step. If the floor were too smooth, a person might unconsciously slow their pace. If too coarse, they might accelerate as though escaping discomfort. Either effect could distort spatial perception because human brains often gauge distance and depth through the cadence of walking. The floor's texture needed to merge with the foot, providing minimal grip that neither controlled nor hindered movement. Sensory psychologists added that even slight shifts in walking rhythm can create the impression that the space is directing someone's movement. They noted that the human brain is highly sensitive to changes in pattern, even those that form unconsciously. If a person feels their steps become more orderly or more erratic, for no clear reason, they may conclude that the space holds a hidden character. Thus, the balance between free movement and patternlessness needed to be protected. Spatial anthropologists further warned that future cultures, whatever they may become, might interpret walking rhythms as signs. If someone experiences a repeating cadence while moving, they might view it as a message, a warning, or a path to follow. Consequently, no pattern should arise from the interaction between human and floor. The space must allow every step to stand alone without forming a sequence that could be read as meaning. In the end, the designers understood that human walking rhythm is a small narrative shaped by body, space, and time. If any of the three exerts even a gentle influence, that narrative could grow into a story passed down through generations. The corridor leading to the isolation chamber must not provide material for such a story. It must be a place where footsteps neither speed up nor slow down, form no pattern or pause, and neither guide nor are guided by the surrounding space. Only in that way could the chamber remain a place that offers no rhythm, no message, and no lingering narrative to anyone who might walk there thousands of years in the future. After considering the rhythm of footsteps, the designers turned to something even subtler and often unnoticed: how a person's body perceives distance when moving through the corridor leading to the isolation chamber. They understood that distance perception is shaped not only by sight or footfall, but also by the way the body tightens or releases its muscles while navigating enclosed spaces. Kinesthetic specialists explained that the human body retains a spatial memory that often operates unconsciously. In a narrow space, the body instinctively tenses, while in a larger space, it relaxes. These small cycles of contraction and release can leave long-lasting impressions even when nothing remarkable is seen. Physical design experts emphasized that the corridor's width must rest at a point where the body does not feel compressed, yet does not sense an expansive space that invites curiosity. Its proportions must not trigger any movement pattern. Too narrow, the body will interpret the space as dangerous or important. If too wide, the body may assume it is hiding something larger beyond its walls. Both impressions could spark unwanted imagination. Therefore, the corridor must create a bodily response so neutral that one walks without subtle muscular shifts. Body psychologists added that humans often judge the length of a space based on minor changes in how the body moves. If steps begin to feel heavier or lighter, a person may assume they are nearing or leaving something significant. If such sensations arise consistently, the mind may form the impression that the corridor has a deliberate purpose or direction. This must be prevented. The space must not communicate through the body in any way. Anthropologists further noted that bodily perception is one of the few human constants across cultures. Languages may change, writing may vanish, symbols may disappear, but the human body interprets space in nearly the same way across millennia. Therefore, if the corridor leaves a particular impression on the body, that impression will likely be reinterpreted repeatedly by future civilizations, potentially giving rise to myths the designers never intended. In the end, they agreed that the space must offer a walking experience devoid of additional information. The body must not feel it is entering something significant, nor leaving something meaningful. It must not sense a center ahead or danger behind. The corridor must remain a space without emotional or physical direction. By ensuring that the human body receives no messages as it moves, the designers hoped the corridor would remain empty of meaning, free of interpretation, and leave no trace in the memory of whoever may someday walk through it. After ensuring that the corridor left no impression on the body, the designers turned to something even less visible: how the space would affect a person's awareness once they realized they were moving through an environment that provided no sensory cues at all. They understood that when humans walk through a place that offers no information, no light variations, no echo, no texture shifts, no temperature changes, the mind begins searching for patterns to fill the void. A person may wonder whether they are failing to perceive something, or whether the space is deliberately constructed to be too perfect in its silence. In such moments, awareness may shift from observing the environment to observing itself, like an unexpected mirror reflecting inward thoughts. Phenomenologists refer to this state as a shift of perceptual center, when one no longer feels inside a space, but instead feels the space residing inside them. If allowed to develop, this sensation can create spiritual or mystical interpretations, something the designers were determined to avoid. They did not want future generations to view the corridor as a site of inner revelation or symbolic passage. Therefore, the space had to be silent enough to suppress sensory information, yet not so silent that it provoked excessive introspection. Acoustic consultants proposed a balance. The walls should not absorb every echo completely, but leave a barely perceptible reflection, faint enough to avoid communication, yet present enough to anchor the mind to a physical environment. These subtle echoes were not meant to inform, but to prevent the mind from inventing information in their absence. By keeping awareness moored to physical reality, the corridor would preserve its neutrality. On the other hand, cognitive experts warned that the human brain tends to notice absence, especially when that absence remains perfectly consistent. If there is no change in lighting, no variation in sound, no shift in temperature, and no suggestion of direction, the mind may begin to interpret the emptiness as a hidden message. Thus, the designers needed a space that offered no information without suggesting it was withholding something. Achieving this equilibrium required repeated walking trials with diverse groups to ensure that no dominant sensation emerged. In the end, they realized that the corridor's purpose was not to make someone think, feel, or understand anything. Rather, its purpose was to fade from awareness, to become so neutral that its very existence barely registered in the mind. By minimizing the possibility of interpretation, both physical and internal, the designers hoped the corridor would survive for millennia without becoming the object of stories, rituals, or meanings the creators never intended. After ensuring that the corridor would not induce excessive introspection, the designers turned to something more elusive than bodily sensation or awareness: how time would be perceived inside the space. They understood that time perception often shifts not because of clocks, but because of small events that mark one's passage. If footsteps sound different at a certain point, if the light changes subtly, or if the air grows warmer in one section, the brain will register these as markers that divide the journey into a beginning, middle, and end. Such markers create structure in memory, which would undermine the corridor's purpose: to be a space that is not remembered. Temporal perception specialists emphasize that time feels most neutral when a person does not notice any change. In experiments, they found that humans often cannot estimate the duration of a walk when the experience contains no internal divisions. When everything feels the same, the brain stops counting. But there was another danger. If uniformity was too absolute, the journey would feel unnatural, as though occurring in a sequence of time disconnected from the outside world. Extreme uniformity could make time feel frozen, producing a sensation of stagnation that might easily be misinterpreted as psychological pressure. To avoid both extremes, the designers sought ways to create a flat experience of time while staying within normal limits of human perception. They engineered a very subtle airflow, almost imperceptible, resulting from the natural pressure difference between the entrance and the central chamber. This airflow did not provide orientation or distance cues, but simply assured the body that the physical world was still operating. This kept the brain aligned with a normal temporal rhythm without assigning the space any unusual character. Environmental lighting experts recommended a light that was completely consistent, yet not static. The illumination needed microfluctuations generated by natural sources or mechanisms mimicking real-world ambient variation. These fluctuations would not be directly noticeable, but would act as faint signals that time continued to move. They called this mechanism the subtle pulse of time, designed not to be seen, but to prevent the mind from fabricating stronger imaginary markers. In the end, all these decisions served a single purpose: to create a journey that takes place without feeling like it takes place. Time should feel neither fast nor slow. It should pass without imprint. If someone left the corridor unable to recall whether they were inside for 1 minute or 5, the designers would know they had succeeded in crafting a space that nearly erases itself from human experience. After neutralizing the perception of time, the designers turned to another defining element of human experience: how a person understands their own presence within a space. They recognize that each individual carries a subtle inner imprint when entering an unfamiliar place. This imprint is not a specific memory, but a tendency to judge whether the space is safe, dangerous, or carries some inexplicable significance. Environmental psychologists explain that a sense of self-presence often arises from the interaction between space and attention. If a space offers even the faintest suggestion of leading towards something meaningful, the visitor may perceive themselves as a participant in a sequence of events. If the space offers no signals at all, one might feel as if they are passing through without being part of anything. The designers realized that this isolation corridor must avoid both extremes. On one hand, it must not make someone feel they are entering something significant, as such impressions could spark elaborate interpretations that endure across generations. On the other hand, it must not cause someone to feel non-existent or dissolved into a boundless emptiness. The sensation of losing oneself could just as easily give rise to powerful myths, especially among cultures that interpret emptiness as a divine or mystical presence. To reach this nearly impossible middle point, specialists in self-perception collaborated with architects of silent spaces. They designed an environment where a person's attention would not be drawn toward themselves, nor toward the surrounding architecture. They sought a psychological state in which one does not feel like the center of events, but also does not feel erased. One method they discovered was to ensure that the space lacked visual, acoustic, or tactile features that could act as psychological mirrors. A psychological mirror is anything that makes someone aware of their own presence, whether through reflections, returning sounds, or changes in air reacting to movement. Sensory experts refined this by ensuring that all environmental responses were slow and diffuse, rather than immediate and focused. If the air moved, its movement must not correspond to the person's steps. If the light shifted, the shift must not align with any action. This way, the body and mind would not receive signals suggesting they were influencing the space. In such conditions, a person can walk without feeling watched, followed, or acknowledged by the environment. In the end, the designers concluded that the space must allow someone to feel present, yet not important, existent, yet not guided. in motion yet without narrative purpose. By ensuring that self-presence is neither amplified nor erased, the corridor becomes a place that does not provoke interpretations about the identities of those who pass through it. In this flattened state of presence, the designers hoped no stories, symbols, or identities would arise from the simple act of walking. After ensuring that self-presence would neither be heightened nor erased, the designers turned to a deeper and more fragile layer of human experience: how a person senses a center or direction within a space even when no markers are present. They understood that humans carry an innate tendency to imagine that every space has a core and invisible point that anchors inner movement. Spatial perception specialists explained that even when someone walks through a completely neutral environment, their body and mind still attempt to infer a gravitational pull of meaning, as though the space possesses a hidden intention. This instinct is powerful and can generate long narratives from the faintest impression. Thus, the designers concluded that the corridor leading to the isolation chamber must not create any illusion of a center or destination. They recognized that a center does not need to be an object. It can arise from slight temperature shifts, from subtle air movements, from a pocket of deeper silence, or from the way a step feels marginally different at one location. Small variations like these can suggest that someone is approaching a significant point, even when nothing exists there. Environmental physicists examined every natural change that could occur over thousands of years, simulating how geothermal heat might slowly seep along salt layers, how pressure might shift in minute ways, and how these forces might produce a false center within the corridor. Psychologists added that the illusion of a center is one of the most universal triggers of human fantasy. When someone feels they are nearing an important point, the mind begins constructing narratives. Perhaps something lies ahead. Perhaps something was left behind. Perhaps something must be found. They noted that such interpretations require no evidence at all. They can arise simply from a sense that the space has become slightly quieter or slightly warmer. If the corridor accidentally creates such illusions, future generations might develop legends casting the place as sacred or dangerous. To prevent this possibility, spatial geometry experts designed the corridor so that every sensory distribution remains completely flat. There must be no slightly warmer or cooler zones, no marginally quieter or denser pockets. They ensured that any natural variations would be dispersed evenly through structural choices that absorb or diffuse changes before they reach human perception. The goal was to produce a corridor without emotional or conceptual direction. In the end, the designers hoped that by removing all traces of a center, whether real or illusory, the corridor would become a space that never suggests that someone is headed toward anything. They wanted anyone walking through it to feel not that they are approaching meaning, but simply moving. In the absence of inner direction, they hoped the corridor would never become the origin of stories, beliefs, or quests of any kind. After ensuring the corridor would not create illusions of a center, the designers turned their attention to another subtle yet enduring element: how the impression of the wall surfaces might influence someone walking within the space. They recognized that humans have a strong tendency to judge the age, meaning, and purpose of a place solely from the texture on its surfaces. Even when a person does not touch anything, their eyes instinctively read minute patterns, faint cracks, or slight color shifts as messages left behind by history. Material specialists emphasize that walls with even minor variations can be interpreted as repaired, reused, or abandoned by earlier visitors. Thus, they agreed that the walls must convey nothing beyond their physical existence. Salt's natural textures had to be selected and shaped so that they revealed no direction formed, no readable lines, and displayed no dramatic color differences. Mineralogists examined salt crystals from multiple depths, ensuring the surface structures lacked motifs that might spark imagination. They avoided natural patterns resembling branches, ridges, or shapes that could be mistaken for symbols. The goal was to make the walls appear old, but not historical, solid, but not monumental, natural, but not communicative. Visual psychologists reminded the team that humans often create narratives simply by looking at a long line or erosion mark on a wall. Such patterns can make someone believe the space has shifted over time, or that the wall has recorded the passage of eras. If that happened, the corridor could become a place that seems to hold a hidden story. Therefore, any repeated lines, any subtle cracks pointing toward a single direction, or any flow-like markings had to be removed or softened. The wall must not be something that has witnessed history. It must be merely a surface. The designers also considered how future artificial light might interact with the surfaces. A texture too reflective could create illusions of movement or glow, while one too matte might appear to conceal something within its darkness. They selected mineral textures that reflect light gently without producing complex shadows. There must be no edges that look like small doors or recesses, hinting at something behind them. In the end, they hoped the walls would become something that cannot be retold. Not interesting, not instructive, not expressive. Only a quiet presence without intention to form memory. In this absence of meaning, they wanted to ensure that anyone passing through would not pause, would not speculate, and would not feel the wall had anything to say. It must remain a surface, consistent, calm, and without a past. As the designers imagined how someone from the future might walk through the corridor, they understood that such a journey would not be purely physical, but also an inner experience shaped slowly by the combination of footsteps, soft echoes, and the sense that no other space exists beyond that passage. They pictured a visitor who knew nothing about the site's history, perhaps a wanderer lost in his route, or a researcher pursuing a quest unaware of the danger sealed beneath the ground. In their imagination, this person moves carefully, hearing every breath as if the faint echoes were rising from walls that have no intention of offering answers. This is why the designers felt it was essential to create a space that added no emotional weight to the minds of those who passed through it. To achieve this, they studied how the corridor's length and height could influence the rhythm of human steps. A corridor too tall could make someone feel small and isolated, while one too low could evoke pressure or confinement. They chose proportions that allowed a traveler to walk without sensing the space was judging them. The dimensions were crafted so the corridor would not feel like the entrance to something grand, nor like the approach to a suppressive secret. Simplicity of form was the key, preventing the mind from starting unnecessary associations. Next, they considered the interval between echoes. If the floor were too hard, footsteps would sound sharp, causing a person to speculate about the scale of unseen chambers. If too soft, the echoes would vanish, making the space feel as though it absorbed all traces of life. They selected a surface that reflected sound gently, creating a resonance that did not provoke curiosity. Footsteps should exist only as a reminder of movement, nothing more. They also reflected on how air would flow through the corridor. Air that is too cold could make someone feel they were nearing danger, while air too warm might give the illusion of hidden machinery or life behind the walls. The corridor was therefore engineered to maintain a neutral temperature, ensuring that no atmospheric shift would trigger unnecessary imagination. The air should feel ordinary, just like the corridor itself. In the end, they wanted the experience of passing through the space to be one that does not cling to memory. No awe, no unease, no feeling that the corridor carries intent. It must be a place that is passed through rather than remembered. A silent transition that asks for no attention and leaves no imprint. In that way, anyone who moves through it will feel no need to turn back or question what lies at the quiet edge of the path. In the next stage, the designers examined how sounds carried by distance might behave when someone entered the deeper portion of the corridor. They understood that every enclosed space has its own acoustic character, and that this character can influence the feelings of anyone passing through. A space that reflects sound too rapidly can make a person feel confined, while one that absorbs sound too heavily may create the impression that the walls are closing in as though swallowing every noise. For this reason, acoustic specialists conducted a series of tests to find a balance in which sound would feel neither foreign nor capable of revealing the size of unseen chambers. They observed how human footsteps vary from one individual to another. Some walk quickly and lightly, while others move more slowly with heavier pressure. They realized that echoes too consistent might make someone feel accompanied by a rhythm not their own, while echoes too soft would make footsteps seem to vanish into darkness. They therefore selected materials capable of breaking sound reflections into small scattered resonances that are difficult to trace. Each step should be audible enough to confirm one's presence in a physical space, but not strong enough to allow interpretation of distance or direction. The designers then imagined how human breathing would sound within the corridor. They understood that when someone feels even slightly uneasy, their breathing becomes quicker, and the faint sounds produced can trigger unnecessary imagination. If a breath's reflection returned like a whisper from an unknown direction, a person might begin to sense the corridor is not entirely empty. To prevent this, the walls were engineered to let breath dissipate without forming long echoes. The sound must remain close to the body, not spreading through the space, not forming acoustic shadows, and not returning in a way that stimulates questioning. They also considered the possibility that body sounds such as clothing friction or the soft movement of a worn bag might become strange in confined spaces. If these sounds were reflected with unusual intensity, a traveler could believe the corridor itself held some form of life. Thus, they adjusted the wall surfaces so such small noises would not travel too far. Every sound must remain the property of the person who made it, not transforming into something that feels generated by the corridor. In the end, the designers sought to create an acoustic condition that neither adds mystery nor diminishes awareness. The space must sound neutral, not provoking fear, not stirring imagination, and not giving the impression that something hides behind the shifting air. In this way, anyone passing through would feel the corridor is merely a quiet path, offering no story beyond its own existence. Once the acoustics had been refined to a point where they conveyed almost no message, the designers turned to the question of how temperature might shape a person's understanding of the corridor they walked through. They understood that temperature is one of the most subtle human experiences and often forms a part of intuition that works unnoticed. A space that is a little too cold can make someone feel the room is drawing energy from their body, while a space that is slightly too warm may suggest hidden activity behind the walls. They therefore sought a temperature that would not evoke emotional reactions. It must not trigger tension, nor imply that the corridor contains a life of its own. Thermal specialists studied how the human body responds to tiny variations in air movement. They noted that even when a person does not feel wind directly, extremely slow air currents can still create a sense of being watched or followed. Air flowing from a single direction can imply a center emitting something, while air moving irregularly may make someone feel the space is unfinished. To prevent such interpretations, they ensured the airflow remained stable, nearly imperceptible, and entirely without direction. The air must be still like water, untouched by wind. They also considered how temperature shifts when a human body enters the space. As a person walks, their body heats slightly, and this change can create the impression that the room is responding. If the walls trap this warmth, it may feel like the space is reacting in return. To avoid that, the designers selected mineral configurations capable of absorbing minute temperature changes without returning them. In this way, the human body would not sense that the corridor was studying its presence. Next, they reflected on how temperature perception shifts when someone feels alert. In certain states, the body may interpret a neutral temperature as something different from reality. When tense, the same temperature can feel colder, and when calm, it can feel warmer. Physiological psychologists therefore recommended maintaining the corridor at a level nearly identical to the natural temperature of the human body. With this approach, anyone passing through would feel no shift capable of triggering imagination or concern. In the end, the designers wanted the corridor's temperature to be something that cannot be remembered. No coldness reminiscent of the Earth's depths, and no warmth hinting at hidden machinery. The temperature must become a background that speaks of nothing. By ensuring the body receives no signals from the air, they hoped the corridor would remain a quiet space, offering no emotional guidance and leaving no trace on anyone's perception. Once the temperature had been set, so it would leave no impression, the designers began to consider how time itself might be perceived by someone walking through the corridor. They knew that humans do not measure time only through clocks or footsteps, but also through subtle environmental shifts. A slight change in light temperature or air pressure can make someone believe they have walked for a long while, even if only moments have passed. Conversely, a perfectly stable environment can erase the sense of duration, making a person think only a short time has passed when much more has elapsed. Temporal perception specialists explain that the human internal clock is shaped not only by the brain, but also by bodily responses to surroundings. Since the corridor must not offer any clues, the designers had to ensure that no environmental changes could help the body mark the passing seconds. Environmental stability experts analyzed how tiny fluctuations naturally arise, even in a seemingly still space. Walls slowly absorb or release heat minerals, subtly respond to humidity, and air pressure shifts can occur without warning. All of these can create faint signals for the senses. To prevent this, the designers built passive equalization systems, keeping the corridor's conditions constant at all times. No hidden airflow, no micro changes in humidity, and no detectable pressure shifts. The corridor had to be a place where each second felt identical to the last. Cognitive psychologists cautioned that when someone lacks direction, they rely on time as a mental anchor. They may begin counting steps or estimating duration based on feeling. If the corridor offered even slight variation, the person could estimate its length or the distance to its end. Therefore, the designers wanted time to have no foothold there. No cues should make someone feel they have walked too long or too fast. No sense that time was stretching or compressing. They also considered how time perception shifts in long, silent spaces. In such settings, time can feel slowed. But if prolonged too far, the mind may accelerate its own internal narrative to fill the void. To avoid this, they crafted an environmental balance where silence did not invite excessive thought, yet did not create a feeling of waiting. In this way, time would not feel active. Ultimately, the designers wanted time in the corridor to become something that cannot be grasped. Someone walking through should not feel time approaching or receding. No duration should be measurable, no rhythm recognizable, and no moment distinct from any other. They hoped the corridor would become a place where time loses character and becomes mere unnoticed continuity. In this absence of markers, they believed no story could arise from the passage through it. After they had made time impossible to grasp, the designers shifted their focus to creating a space that offered no surprises of any kind. They wanted a condition in which a person could never build a mental map of the corridor, because mental maps always require reference points, no matter how small. If someone found a pattern on the wall or a subtle difference in the floor's texture, they could form an idea of the corridor's length, direction of travel, and even recall which parts they had already passed. For this reason, the corridor had to be built with such perfect uniformity that neither the eyes nor the body could detect boundaries or markers. Structural specialists called it an unarticulated space, where no corner stands out, no line grows brighter, and no surface reveals even the slightest distinction. To achieve this, the engineers studied how the human body senses space even with closed eyes. A person can detect small changes in ground vibration, the echo of footsteps, and the resonance of walls. If the corridor were too long, the sound of footsteps would shift in frequency. If too short, the echo might imply nearness. Thus, the engineers calibrated the corridor's geometry so that every step produced the same acoustic response. No elongated echoes, no clipped reflections, and no soft resonances that could indicate size. They shaped the space to erase such cues entirely so that a traveler hears only themselves in a way that cannot be interpreted as spatial information. Environmental psychologists noted that humans excel at detecting patterns. Even unintentional regularities can create a sense of direction. Therefore, the walls were coated with materials free of repeating structures, leaving no visual rhythm to follow. Each surface was designed to resemble visual quiet, a stable absence of form. The goal was to create a sense that the traveler was moving through a space that might not be moving at all, even as their feet carried them forward. They also considered that uniform spaces can evoke emotional reactions. In some cases, too much sameness can cause anxiety. But here, they aimed for a gentler experience. They chose the most neutral color, one that evoked no particular emotion. Not too dark to avoid fear, not too bright to prevent strain. The result was a space that seemed to rest between states, not fully present, yet not entirely absent. Such a space did not provoke curiosity or alarm. It simply accepted the presence of the traveler without offering anything to interpret. In the end, they hoped the corridor would become a space impossible to remember. Not because it was frightening or strange, but because it offered nothing memorable. Every detail was crafted so it would leave no trace in memory, so that anyone passing through might feel they had been somewhere, yet be unable to describe anything about it. This was the kind of forgetfulness they pursued, the kind born not from lost memory, but from the absence of impression. After ensuring the space could not be remembered and time could not be perceived, the designers moved on to the final stage of shaping the corridor that connected the outer world to the isolation vault. They began thinking about how a traveler inside would perceive their own presence. In most environments, the human body always encounters reflections of itself, whether in shadows, footsteps, or shifting light. These cues subtly reinforce the connection between the body and the surrounding space. But if these reflections are removed, a person may feel their presence dissolving into the environment as though walking without leaving any trace. The designers realized that as long as someone could still sense themselves through echoes or shadow, they could still interpret the space. Their next goal was to make human presence produce no recognizable signature. They began with light, the clearest indicator of physical presence. A body typically creates a shadow, even a faint one, and that shadow reveals the light's direction and distance from the walls. To prevent this, they designed a lighting system so uniform it produced no shadow at all. The illumination came not from any single source, but from a diffuse field enveloping the corridor like a constant, unchanging mist. In such conditions, the body could not cast a recognizable outline. No dark forms stretched across the ground, and no dim shapes followed someone's steps. A person walked as if without the visual contour of their own body. Once the lighting was perfected, they turned to sound. The human body generates tiny echoes, breathing footsteps, or even the rustle of clothing. Normally, these echoes would return, however faintly. But here, the designers wanted to remove all acoustic reflection. The walls were fitted with absorptive materials that did not resemble visible dampening panels yet. Swallowed sound without returning it. No echo rolled behind the traveler, and no resonance signaled their presence. Sound died the moment it appeared. The greatest challenge, however, came from the subtle vibrations produced by the body. Every step creates a small tremor through the floor. Using a specialized damping system, the designers ensured the vibrations had no travel. They ended instantly, as though they had never existed. Without vibration, echo, or shadow, a traveler might sense that they no longer experience themselves in familiar ways. Human presence became something that left no physical trace. The designers understood that this could create a deeper sort of silence. Not a silence of space, but a silence of the body itself. All of this was not meant to inspire fear, but to ensure the corridor offered nothing for memory or perception to hold on to. A traveler passing through would feel present without being able to map that presence. They would walk without time, without space, and without shadow, as though their body were moving through a world that did not require an observer. The designers believed that only through such conditions could the corridor truly serve as a gateway to something that must remain unknown. A passage that keeps nothing and carries nothing. Only quiet continuity toward the room that must never be opened. Once the physical aspects of the corridor's design had been completed, the designers turned to something far more difficult to control: how to ensure the space would not acquire new meaning as time moved forward. They understood that history does not form only from major events, but also from small interpretations that emerge decades or centuries later. Even a perfectly featureless place can become symbolic if future generations decide to treat it as such. Humans naturally impose meaning on anything they cannot fully understand. An empty space can be seen as sacred, and a featureless corridor as a path toward something greater. The designers knew that although they had removed shadows, echoes, direction, and time, the future might still plant stories into the corridor. So they began to consider how the space could remain not only meaningless now, but also resistant to acquiring meaning later. Semiotics experts were invited to explain how symbols can emerge even from places never intended to have any. They noted that humans look for patterns not because the patterns exist, but because the mind needs structure to feel secure. If a space is believed to lead to something forbidden, it can become an object of fear or reverence. A legend may form simply because a new generation decides to believe something without evidence. The designers realized that the greatest danger did not lie in the radioactive materials sealed deep below, but in the narratives that could grow above them long after the designers were gone. If such narratives became strong enough, someone might eventually try to enter simply to confirm or disprove them. For this reason, they shaped the corridor so it could never become iconic in collective imagination. No distinctive forms, no recognizable colors, no architectural elements that could catch someone's interest. They avoided intersections that created appealing geometry. Every curve, every end, and every meeting of walls had to feel like part of something without a beginning and without a center. They avoided beauty and avoided roughness because both could feed future stories. They wanted the corridor to be something no one ever wrote about because no word felt necessary to describe it. The most challenging part was imagining how future generations might perceive the space. Cultural psychologists simulated many possibilities: curious generations, skeptical ones, symbol-seeking ones, and indifferent ones. Across every scenario, one thing remained: constant human beings can always create stories where none were intended. So the designers understood that their goal was not to stop stories, but to make the corridor unworthy of being given one. Not interesting, not provocative, not mysterious in a way that invites exploration. Only mysterious in a way that encourages distance. In the end, they realized that the corridor was not merely a path to a forbidden room, but a statement about how humanity must learn to leave certain things untouched. A structure that asks for no attention, no admiration, and no memory. They hoped that by creating a corridor incapable of receiving meaning, the future would never attempt to inscribe meaning onto it. In that absence of meaning, they hoped to protect the world from itself. After discussing how meaning could grow even from meaninglessness, the designers turned to something more troubling: how human. Curiosity can survive long after the reasons that sparked it are forgotten. They understood that curiosity is not only triggered by something interesting, but also by something that cannot be explained. A completely empty space can awaken a quieter yet deeper kind of curiosity, lingering pull, like a soundless echo that repeats itself in the mind. Behavioral psychologists noted that humans often pursue things not because they believe answers await, but because uncertainty itself feels like a question demanding resolution. If the corridor appeared to avoid meaning, future generations might ask why it must avoid it. So the designers sought a way for the corridor to appear not just empty, but unworthy of thought. They did not want it to feel like something is being hidden very carefully, for that alone would provoke interest. They tried to create an atmosphere that, while featureless, subtly signaled that nothing behind it was worth seeking. Not a threat, not a mystery, not a puzzle. A space that, though unfamiliar, provoked no questions. Behavioral anthropologists added that curiosity often grows from social ritual. The moment one person tells another that a place should not be entered, that place can become an object of shared pursuit. Warnings can create legends. Thus, the designers realized that explicit messages of danger might strengthen future generations' desire to test whether the danger is real. They shaped everything to seem ordinary, like part of an abandoned project, a remnant of a structural plan with notes, purpose, no name, and no story to pass on. They also considered a future in which humanity has forgotten the original reason the site was built. If collective memory fades, the corridor could become an archaeological puzzle. Heritage specialists warned that something inexplicable often attracts researchers rather than repels them. So the designers sought to create a corridor so unremarkable that anyone who discovered it would assume it was a failed construction, an unfinished annex, or a structure that was abandoned before use. But the longer they discussed it, the clearer it became that nothing could completely stop human curiosity. They could only weaken it, make it thin enough that it never grows into an investigation. Create a space that leaves no questions, but also provides no answers. A space that neither invites nor forbids. In the end, they wished the corridor would convey one unspoken message: that there is no reason for anyone to return once they have passed through. That whatever lies at its end is not something worth seeking, not because it is dangerous, nor because it is secret, but because the world does not need another story born from this place. In that quiet, they hoped human curiosity would finally find its limit. After accepting that curiosity could never be erased completely, the designers turned to a more intricate relationship between humans and space. That every human-made place, no matter how simple, eventually becomes a mirror for the mind that moves through it. They understood that people do not merely interpret space, they generate narratives within it. Even a perfectly empty corridor can become a stage for interpretations never intended. Someone alone for too long might imagine the corridor has a secret purpose. Someone under emotional weight might see it as a metaphor for their life. Even someone who seeks nothing at all may inadvertently insert a personal meaning into that quiet. Philosophers of space warn that emptiness often gives the mind unlimited room to wander. In a featureless place, humans fill the void with whatever they carry inside: small fears, faint hopes, or unresolved memories. The designers realized a paradox. The more they removed meaning, the easier it became for people to imagine their own. If misunderstood, the corridor could turn into a canvas for emotional projection. To counter this, they sought to give the corridor a quality that made it not only empty, but inhospitable to the human impulse to project stories. Not frightening, but offering no shapes that could serve as symbols. No dramatic tension, no patterns that look intentional. No feature distinct enough to spark interpretation. The environment had to reach a point where the mind finds nothing to grasp. Architectural psychologists added that humans create meaning when they sense rhythm or change. If the corridor were to silence, someone might believe the silence was deliberate. If too long, they might treat the length as metaphor. Thus, its stability had to prevent imagination from taking over, while also not feeling overly controlled. The silence needed to feel natural, not constructed. Yet even after all these considerations, the designers knew they could only reduce the chance of story formation, not eliminate it. Humans carry stories with them everywhere that cannot be stopped. All that could be done was to create a place that gave them no reason to deepen those stories. In the end, they hoped anyone who passed through the corridor would feel that the place wanted nothing from them. No meaning, no explanation, no attention. A space that reflects nothing back only, a flat, indifferent continuity. In that indifference, they hoped human narrative would halt before it could take shape. After considering how narratives might be halted before they form, the designers turned to something more subtle. How a space can influence memory, even without offering any meaningful experience. They understood that human memory does not store only important events. Sometimes it preserves the unimportant precisely because the lack of significance creates a small disturbance in the flow of experience. A corridor that is too empty can leave a faint trace simply because the mind attempts to understand why it perceived nothing. Neuromnemonics specialists explained that memory is not always built from events, but from mismatches between expectation and reality. If someone expects a corridor to contain something, anything, and finds nothing, the emptiness may linger longer than intended. The designers sought to avoid that. They did not want the corridor to become one of those strange but hard to describe experiences because such categories are always dangerous. They make a person think about them again, often unconsciously. So they aim to create a mental structure in which the corridor would forget itself within the mind. They shape the space not to feel meaningless, but to feel as though it never entered the process of meaning evaluation at all. Not a place that invites interpretation, not a place that rejects it, simply a place that barely registers. Memory processing experts advise that the easiest experiences To forget are those that resemble extremely ordinary daily patterns, things that cause no disruption, no violation of expectation. So the designers asked whether the corridor could be given a quality that made it feel like part of a routine, even to someone who had never been there before. They imagined an atmosphere that made a person feel as though they had seen something similar, or perhaps walked through something like it without remembering when. Faint familiarity that provokes no questions. But they also recognize the danger of familiarity that is too precise. If the corridor felt as though it was imitating something known, it could create an uncanny sensation, making it memorable in the worst possible way. Thus, the familiarity had to sit at a perceptual threshold, close enough to resemble an ordinary place, but not so similar that it appeared intentional. A neutral shape, a rhythm without rhythm, a structure that could belong anywhere and therefore belongs nowhere in memory. In the end, they hoped that anyone leaving the corridor would carry no impression at all. No internal sentence, no subtle reflection, not even an observation about its length or shape. The experience should fade instantly, like a step never recorded. In that impermanence, they believed the corridor could fulfill its purpose, a space that creates no story and leaves no trace. In the deepening silence, their journey suddenly felt like crossing two worlds at once, the world they could see, and another one they could only sense through the whispers of wind tapping softly against the stone walls. Every step carried them farther from the sound of civilization, yet closer to something that seemed to have been waiting long before they were born, a form of ancient knowledge hidden beneath layers of time. The flickering firelight cast long shadows on the walls, as though those shadows were not mere reflections, but old guardians watching them quietly. The scent of mineral dust mixed with dampness made the air heavy, yet strangely captivating, as if it held stories refusing to fade. One of them suddenly halted, not from fear, but from an indescribable sensation, a faint vibration under his palm as he touched the wall, as though a pulse of life flowed within the stone. When he pressed his ear closer, he heard distant echoes like footsteps belonging to a time long gone. "This place is not dead," he whispered, and the others fell silent. Not out of disbelief, but because they felt it too, yet hesitated to admit it. Sometimes silence becomes the loudest voice, and that night, within the ancient chamber, they began to understand the meaning of a quiet that speaks. The farther they walked, the more old carvings emerged, spirals, broken lines, symbols they could not translate. But beneath the incomprehension lay a sense that the carvings were not decorations. They were emotional maps of an old civilization, fear, hope, wisdom, and unease left behind so one day someone might find them. One explorer brushed dust from a large carving resembling an open eye, and instantly felt as if something without a body was gazing back at him, consciousness crossing the boundaries of time. Yet instead of stepping back, they felt an even stronger urge to learn more. Perhaps that is humanity's nature from the beginning of history, to move not only to discover new worlds, but to discover themselves reflected in those worlds. And as they entered the final narrowing corridor, only one feeling remained, that behind every secret they uncovered, a greater question waited in the next depth. When the passage finally opened into a wider chamber, the explorers fell silent not from fear, but from awe at the drastic change in atmosphere. The room was filled with a faint glow that did not come from their torches, a soft bluish luminescence emanating from the stone walls, as if the rocks themselves held remnants of a long-lost light. It was not blinding, but calming, inviting them to step closer and understand its origin. The floor, previously covered in dust, now appeared cleaner, as though the place had been tended to or used not too long ago. No footprints, no signs of life, yet an unmistakable feeling lingered. This chamber had only recently been left by something that wished to remain unseen. At the center stood a stone structure resembling an altar or offering table, but far more refined in craftsmanship. Its surface bore carvings that looked newer than those in the previous corridor, deeper lines, more precise shapes, suggesting a maker who possessed advanced knowledge of geometry and symbolism. One of the explorers, the most meticulous of them, studied it carefully. "These aren't symbols," he whispered. "They're instructions, or records." The others frowned, trying to decipher them, but the longer they stared, the clearer it became that these carvings formed a structured diagram, like a map depicting the flow of energy or pathways through space. Then something happened, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to shift the air as though an unseen presence had just taken a deep breath. The bluish light pulsed gently, like a heart waking from a long slumber. They exchanged glances, unsure whether the sensation was real or a fatigue-induced illusion. But the faint vibration did not cease. It grew stronger, filling the chamber with a warm current flowing from the walls toward the stone altar. Each breath carried a new, scent-like damp earth after the first rain of the season, touching some ancient collective memory within them. Without realizing it, one of them stepped forward, drawn closer by curiosity stronger than caution. A hand reached out, trembling slightly, unable to resist the urge to know what was awakening before them. And the moment a fingertip touched the deepest carving, a hum emerged from within the stone, not a language, but a rhythm that felt like a message from the past or the future they could not tell. They only understood one thing. This chamber was not merely an archaeological discovery. It was a doorway to a new understanding, a quiet warning that whatever dwelled within it had now begun to awaken. As the faint echo from within the stone began to fade, the chamber seemed to hold its breath, creating a silence so dense the explorers could hear their own heartbeats. Yet it was not a frightening silence. It felt more like the quiet found in a sacred place where time follows a different rhythm. The bluish glow along the walls appeared more concentrated, merging into a gentle current that swirled around the stone altar like a thin mist made of pure light. You could imagine yourself standing there, sensing a strange calm drifting through the air, as though the room was deciding whether you were worthy of seeing deeper or merely a passing visitor, incapable of understanding the depth of its history. Then, without warning, the carvings on the stone structure began to show subtle shifts, almost imperceptible, as if the lines were adjusting themselves to the presence of the explorers. What once appeared to be geometric patterns now seemed more alive, flowing with the contours of the space. One explorer examined it closer and realized the pattern was slowly forming something resembling a three-dimensional map. Not a map of the Earth's surface, but a map depicting an underground network far more extensive than they had ever imagined. The spaces were connected in an organic pattern, like veins in the body of an unknown living entity. They saw twisting corridors, layered paths, branching passages leading to locations that had never been recorded in any archaeological archive. To their surprise, one of the pathways on the map glowed slightly brighter than the rest, as if indicating a specific direction. It led to a chamber situated much deeper, darker, and perhaps older than the room they currently occupied. This chamber was marked with a symbol, unlike the others. It was simpler, yet carried a heavier meaning, a warning or perhaps an invitation. The explorers exchanged looks full of curiosity mixed with uncertainty. They did not know whether the highlighted path signaled danger or served as a guide towards something long hidden from the world. The bluish light pulsing throughout the chamber began to soften, and the energy settled once more. But the sense that they had been invited to witness something they were not supposed to remained suspended in the air, as if the chamber had revealed only a fragment of its secrets and now waited to see if they possessed the courage to go deeper. You could feel that in that moment something had changed, not just in the chamber, but within the explorers themselves. They were no longer merely observers. They had become part of a far greater puzzle, one that had waited countless thousands of years to be discovered again. When the explorers finally left the chamber, their steps felt slower, as if every movement required more careful consideration. They did not speak to one another, perhaps because any word felt inappropriate after witnessing something that seemed to exceed the language available to them. You can imagine how the air in the outer hallway felt slightly different, heavier yet calmer, as though the room they had just left was still following them from a distance. The corridor remained silent, as if aware that whatever had happened inside was not meant to be told, and that some truths are created precisely so they never enter human conversation. In those slowed footsteps, they began to realize that the experience had not offered answers at all, but only questions without form. They felt as though they had glimpsed a doorway into something older than human history, something not waiting to be discovered, but simply waiting to remain. Some of them tried to recall the shape of the map, the pathway glowing a little brighter, the simple symbol that felt heavier than the rest. Yet the memory began to tremble, like a shadow that could not be fully held. And the more they tried to remember, the more they understood that most of its details had already faded, becoming vague, becoming something that could be sensed but never clearly described. You might feel a kind of calm emerging from that uncertainty, as though the chamber itself allowed its mystery to remain intact, keeping a gentle distance between humanity and something beyond its grasp. The explorers eventually reached the small doorway leading from the inner chamber back to the ordinary world of the surface. When they stepped through it, there was no dramatic light, no shifting sound, no sign that they had just encountered something capable of reshaping their understanding of the world. Only steps returning to their familiar rhythm, becoming light again, as though the corridor had quietly closed itself behind them, and perhaps that was its intention. Some rooms do not wait to be understood, do not ask to be revealed, and do not wish for their names to be written in human history. Some spaces want only to remain spaces, left quiet in their own time, guarded by a silence older than language. When the explorers looked at the night sky outside, they carried no answers or certainties. What they carried instead was the awareness that the world still hides places that do not wish to be found, places that become part of a story only when someone is fortunate or, perhaps, sufficiently lost to encounter them. As they walked away, the mystery remained in the air, neither approaching nor retreating. It simply stayed there, like a whisper that never finishes, waiting not to be explained, but to be forgotten slowly, as all ancient secrets eventually choose their own fate.